The Impossible Dream is the third episode of the fourth season of Frasier. This is directed by David Lee, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I talk about what happens in this episode. And this one makes me eat my words a little bit. As I have mentioned before, I'm sure, I don't care for dream sequences in TV shows or films. Generally, there are exceptions, but generally I find them really dull. But despite the fact that this one has numerous dream sequences, and it is indeed all about this same dream, it's actually pretty fascinating, and I rather enjoyed it. So as I said, there will be spoilers from now as I go through things chronologically and share some thoughts. It actually starts off with the dream, and Frasier is in bed, and he looks at his arm, and the word Chesty is either tattooed there or written on there. And he then looks up, he hears a noise to the side, and then we see Gil Chesterton. And obviously Frasier is very confused by this. The next day, he tries to tell Roz when he's down at KCL. He tries to tell Roz about the dream without mentioning Gil, but Roz manages to figure it out because Gil comes into the room to tempt Frasier with some sweet food, and Gil was rather delightful at that point, and Ross was able to figure it out, and Frasier kind of accidentally told Bulldog because he thought Bulldog knew, and then he tried to defend things, and it's definitely not a comfortable time for Frasier, but I think what's bothering him more is the fact that he doesn't know how to interpret the dream. So he tells Niles about it down at Cafe Nervosa, and I have to say he was rather remiss, because he's telling Niles this dream, and he mentions the Chesty tattoo, but he doesn't explain who he's in bed with, and that's really remiss, because Niles could potentially then be trying to analyse what the word Chesty means, but obviously Frasier knows at least which character it refers to, so I feel like that was something that he definitely shouldn't have neglected to tell Niles. Gil comes into Cafe Nervosa, he now knows about the situation, and then it's just Niles and Frasier again, and Niles asks Frasier to focus on one object in the room, something that really stands out to him, and Frasier mentions a crescent lamp, and Niles manages to make that lamp stretch to being about Daphne, just by way of example to show Frasier what he wants him to do, and then Frasier tries it, and he decides that it's about the fact that he was being too rigid with his diet, which I have to say is a bit of a stretch, but at the same time, it was also quite logical the way he talked through it. I guess that could be helpful if you have a dream that you're trying to interpret, focus on the one thing that you're drawn to most. I'm assuming Frasier was mostly drawn to Gil, but the lamp apparently stood out. It could help. He then has the dream again, and we then briefly cut to Daphne and Martin in a lift, and it's actually a little uncomfortable. I don't enjoy what they were doing. I think the performances were great, but it does make me feel uneasy. They're basically playing games with people in the lift by having rather cryptic conversations that seem very criminal. Very well written, but a little uncomfortable. Then back in the apartment, there's a suggestion that maybe Martin could help analyse the dream. Maybe it's something Frasier has suppressed from his childhood, and Martin doesn't really want to have anything to do with this. Daphne suggests it's to do with a pet, because Gil is in the shower, fish have water, fish go in water, and what do fish have? Gills, Gil Chesterton. And then they somehow manage to think, okay, maybe it is about a childhood pet, and then they start talking about their mother, whose name, of course, was Hester, and they wondered if Martin ever called her Hesty, which is one letter away from Chesty. They are really reaching at this point. I know dreams can be very complex, but at this point I think they're taking it to an extreme, and they think that it must be about their mother because Gil's a food critic, food criticism, mother. That's their logic, and unfortunately that still doesn't solve the problem, because Frasier yet again has the dream, and I like the fact that the dream is very brief. We see this same scene of Frasier waking up and having the dream, I think 4 or 5 times, but it doesn't get boring because it is quite short, and with each one there is that bit of suspense of wondering what's going to be different about it this time. And with this time, it is very amusing because Frasier is thinking, okay, it's about my mother, so that's my mother in the shower. He calls out, "Mommy!" And Gil comes out and says, "Patience, Daddy," which for Frasier was terrifying, but very, very funny. Frasier can't sleep, or maybe doesn't want to sleep. Martin gets up in the middle of the night, and Frasier confesses to him that the dream was actually about Gil. Martin does not want to hear this. He does not want to listen at all. But eventually Frasier is able to open up to him. He says he's worried that his mind is trying to tell him that he's gay. And as Martin pointed out, you probably would know by now. And Frasier dismisses this idea, and he and Martin are able to talk a little bit more, and Frasier comes to the determination that his mind has created a dream that defies interpretation, his words, not mine, because he's not being challenged by the callers on his show. The callers on his show, as we learn at the beginning of the episode, are phoning in with very mundane problems that are not very complex for the psychiatrist to analyse and assess. So in Frasier's mind, his dream has created these complex scenarios for him to try and work out. But there is no answer to it, other than the fact that there is no answer, kind of like the only rule is there are no rules. Doesn't logically make sense, but this is the conclusion Frasier has reached, and we then have the dream for, I think, a fifth time, and we get not Gil this time, but Freud, played by Byrne Piven, and we almost end the episode, with Frasier in bed with Freud, which I found very amusing. And we actually end with another dream. Not Frasier this time, but Eddie. We see Eddie in his dream jumping up and down in front of the kitchen counter looking at, I think, muffins. And then in present day, Eddie wakes up and goes to the kitchen and starts jumping up and down. There are no muffins, but his dream led him to believe there were, and he's just absolutely adorable. So it is a great episode. It is definitely very fascinating. We have some very funny moments. As I said, I don't ordinarily like anything about dreams when it's in TV shows or films. I just find them so mundane and I'm not talking about this episode, but it's such a lazy way of showing things sometimes. Not always. I just feel like there are better ways of moving the narrative forward. Don't show us that the character is scared because they had a nightmare. Show us they're scared through their actions when they're awake. And I feel like it's a bit of a cop-out a lot of the time. And I'm saying this as a writer who does write dream sequences. I do have dreams in my novels, even though I hate reading them. So I understand the benefit of them, but I don't necessarily enjoy them. And thankfully, with The Impossible Dream, this is an exception. I really think it's a really strong episode, really fascinating, great performances. Nice to spend a decent amount of time with Gil as well, because we don't do that too frequently. Needless to say, I think The Impossible Dream is a pretty good episode of Frasier.